On this episode of the State of Purple podcast, a late night edition, Jim Harbaugh headed back to the University of Michigan, no longer an option for the Minnesota Vikings at head coach. Either are Raheem Morris or Patrick Graham. So it is Kevin O'Connell who is set to become the next Minnesota Vikings head coach. We talk about that next on the State of Purple podcast presented by Pilot Games.
Seconds to go. We need a Minneapolis miracle. Case on a deep drop. Steps up in the pocket. He'll fire to the right side. Off by Diggs. Stay up. Oh my God. 30. No 10. Touchdown. Are you kidding me? Miracle finish. It's a Minneapolis miracle. Oh my God. No way. What a miracle finish!
And welcome into the State of Purple. That's Jack Day. I'm AJ Mansour. And Jack, just when we thought that this head coaching situation, with all the drama surrounding the Minnesota Vikings old head coaches and new head coaches, couldn't get any stranger, today happens. I'm going to pull up on the screen here. You'll see it at the bottom. Kevin O'Connell set to become the new Minnesota Vikings head coach. Now, Jack, how did that happen? I know I know many people in the chat know, but a 9-hour interview for Jim Harbaugh goes on today at Twin Cities Orthopedic Performance Center. 9 hours, the second 9-hour interview. We saw Patrick Graham had a 9-hour interview yesterday. Jim Harbaugh came here. It was all but a done deal. I mean, every report we had seen coming into today was basically saying if they offer him the job, he's ready to take it. And it was assumed that because he was Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah's number one target, that he was going to be offered the job. Turns out he wasn't offered the job. Reports tonight are that the Minnesota Vikings never offered Jim Harbaugh the position. And Jim Harbaugh hopped on the phone and told the University of Michigan that he's heading back to be the coach of the Wolverines as long as they want him. Then Jack, reports come out that the Vikings hopped on the phone. They talked to Raheem Morris. They told him he was no longer a candidate. They hopped on the phone and they talked to Patrick Graham. And they told him he was no longer a candidate, leaving one finalist, the Los Angeles Rams offensive coordinator, Kevin O'Connell, to become the next head coach of the Minnesota Vikings. Now, it can't be official until after the Super Bowl. But, Jack, a whirlwind of a day. We were all set and ready to put our khakis on and celebrate tonight, and that's not happening. Tell me how you're feeling right now with Kevin O'Connell, the next Minnesota Vikings head coach.
Yeah, it almost feels like you and I were talking about this a couple of days ago, that it couldn't get any weirder than it got after the Harbaugh news broke originally.
Right.
Boy, were we wrong. What an awkward conversation that had to be for Jim Harbaugh to have with the University of Michigan as well. Right. After, I think the tweet that I saw this morning from one of the guys that I've been following, who followed the situation pretty closely, he had it at like an 80 to 20, it was 80-20 chance that he took the job in Minnesota, and he ends up leaving Minnesota without even getting a deal. It was a weird situation. I think if you go back and watch the show from Monday, I think you can find AJ actually listing O'Connell as his number one candidate. But I think we were talking a little bit about this before the show. Feels like you and myself included, and pretty much the rest of the state of Minnesota kind of talked themselves into this idea that Jim Harbaugh was going to be the next coach of the Minnesota Vikings at the end of the day. That's not the case, and I still think there's a lot to be excited for, quite frankly, in Kevin O'Connell. I think the Vikings, their fan base, get what they were originally looking for before the Harbaugh sweepstakes began. They were looking for this young, bright-minded, offensive-minded coach. He sees the game through a quarterback's lens, and I love that as well. I said this earlier. Maybe the Vikings necessarily didn't make the sexiest of hires, but long term, I truly believe that this could be the right hire for this team.
Right. It's still sort of exciting, right? I mean, everyone had just talked themselves into the idea that Jim Harbaugh was the most proven head coach, right? He has a successful track record being a head coach in multiple levels for multiple different organizations and teams. Not only did he do that, but he came to the NFL and he had success. One of the best winning percentages all time for head coaches in the NFL. Had 3 good seasons with the 49ers. The wheels kind of got weird and fell off. We heard some different stories, I guess, different sides of the story the last couple of days about that situation. But it did feel, Jack, like ever since Jim Harbaugh came into this situation, it didn't seem like it was the same sort of vibe that we had felt from Kwesi. It didn't seem like the change in direction that we had thought the organization was going to take. And we spent 4 or 5 days kind of talking ourselves into it. Now, we got to today and we were all talked into it. Like, we were ready for it. Winning coach, proven coach. He can come in and manage the personnel and let Kwesi do the analytics on the side. You know, we talked ourselves into the idea of Jim Harbaugh. But from the outset, it wasn't necessarily like he fit perfectly with this team.
Yeah, and I think Jim Harbaugh talked himself into that job too before the Vikings are ready to claim him as their next head coach. I feel like Courtney Cronin had a really good string of tweets from just a few minutes ago, actually, that kind of talked about some of the sources that she talked to and how Harbaugh walked into this interview already kind of thinking that there was a deal after the 8-9 hour interview wrapped up. That wasn't the case. And then obviously the phone call back to Michigan, that was just, I don't know. Like I said, that had to be extremely awkward. But how about walking into an interview? It doesn't matter if it's the NFL, any type of interview, and walking in and just kind of acting as if the job was already yours. I feel like that could, going into the interview, there were reports that Jim Harbaugh had names within that building that he had to impress. I can't imagine a guy walking in there and thinking that the job is already his is going to turn those heads and make them realize, hey, maybe this is the guy. I feel like that could rub some people the wrong way, and maybe that's the case. Maybe that's not. I don't have any proof behind that statement, but it felt weird to me. And like I said, I think the Vikings still got themselves a young offensive-minded head coach who long-term, it feels like this could be the better hire. I do think there would have been a much higher expectation if Jim Harbaugh were to become the head coach of this team. And now there's a little bit more unknown. We don't really know what Kevin O'Connell is going to do, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah is going to do to this roster. He knows Kirk Cousins really well. He was Kirk Cousins' quarterback coach in 2017. That can make that, I could see that going one of two ways. He could either come in here and he's like, you know what? I know what Kirk Cousins brings to the table. I think the Vikings can win with Kirk Cousins, or he's going to come into the front. He's going to come in and he's going to be like, Kirk's not the guy, which I don't think, I don't know. I'm sure that conversation was brought up in the interview. And one last thing that I wanted to kind of talk about too, it's super weird that they flew out to LA. I can't imagine they had 9-hour interviews with both O'Connell and Raheem Morris in the same day. And then they go back to back with Patrick Graham and Jim Harbaugh. Almost makes you wonder if O'Connell was the front runner all along, maybe they kind of went through that interview process and said, you know what, this is our guy. We're going to do our due diligence. But at the end of the day, maybe O'Connell was always the guy.
It felt like he was always the front runner, initially from that first round of interviews when Kwesi wasn't here. But then once Kwesi got here, they had that second interview on Monday, had an opportunity to talk with him. And it kind of seemed like, Kwesi came to the table and said, okay, let's talk to Patrick Graham. Let's talk to Jim Harbaugh as well. And the rest of the group, whoever is making this decision, the owners, Rob Brzezinski, the power players that are in this mix, Andrew Miller, basically said, okay, you got 9 hours to convince us, right? Convince us that Patrick Graham is the guy. Convince us that Jim Harbaugh is worth the more money, the less power. We give up some things when we bring a guy like Jim Harbaugh in. Convince us. And there was no convincing. Like, it didn't happen. The fact that they so quickly, it sounds like, got on the phone and said, okay, Raheem Morris, no, you're out. Patrick Graham, you're out. Kevin O'Connell, let's finalize this thing. And then after the Super Bowl, we can announce this thing. Tells me that was what they were doing. Like, that was the vibe the whole time, the plan, that if they didn't get convinced by Jim Harbaugh, and it doesn't sound like they did. Again, the Minnesota Vikings didn't offer, according to reports from John Krasinski, Tom Pelissero, the Minnesota Vikings did not offer Jim Harbaugh. It's not like he said no. That was what it initially kind of felt like was the situation. But Jim Harbaugh was not offered a job. So he had to go back to Michigan because I hadn't heard his name outside of Miami in any other situation. So you have this situation now. Kevin O'Connell comes in. You mentioned Kirk Cousins and their history with each other back in Washington. I think that this honestly changes the path for Kirk Cousins. What does Kevin O'Connell as head coach mean for Kirk Cousins? I think that if Jim Harbaugh was here, Kirk Cousins was safe, 100% safe, at least for this season. He would have been the quarterback. They would have taken what they had on the field last year, improved a little bit where they could, but taken the proven quarterback, the NFL quarterback, and had Jim Harbaugh work with him, ready to win right away. The fact that now that's off the table and Kevin O'Connell is the head coach or will be the head coach for the Minnesota Vikings, I think it changes everything completely. I don't think that there is the same mindset that they bring to the table, this old school mindset, this tied into the quarterback that's proven. I think that these guys, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah and Kevin O'Connell, they're both like 40 years old and 36 years old. They're going to be ready to make a move. Like if anybody comes knocking, and we talked the other day, Jack, on a different episode of this podcast about all the teams that could potentially have interest in Kirk Cousins, teams that think that they're one quarterback away from maybe making a Super Bowl run. That list has continued to grow with Tom Brady retiring, with Ben Roethlisberger retiring. You have opportunities for teams that think that they're close to come with a deal that you just can't refuse. And I think that it is more likely now that Kirk Cousins gets traded with Kevin O'Connell as the head coach as it was when Jim Harbaugh was the head coach. Do you have any differing opinions on that, or do you agree?
I agree with you. I think if Harbaugh were to come here, I think the view would have shifted a little bit, that this would that is more of a win now. I still don't necessarily fully buy into it being a full rebuild necessarily, but I've said this leading up to this show this week. There's a lot of issues on the defensive side of the ball, and I don't know how they're going to come up with the cap space necessarily to plug some of those holes, and not only plug those holes, but get some depth to fill in behind those guys, because quite frankly, the depth hasn't been there for this roster for the last couple seasons. And when the guy or some of the superstars, Daniil Hunter, Anthony Barr, if some of those guys miss time, that defense, it goes downhill pretty quickly. And I think this really opens up the door for what's going to happen next with Kirk Cousins. It certainly makes things more interesting for you and myself, because we're going to be talking about this a lot more, because I agree with you. I do think there is a better chance now that Kirk Cousins isn't the quarterback of the Minnesota Vikings in 2022. I'm not saying it's 100% chance that Kirk is not out there starting day one. That's not the case. And I do also want to say, before we get way, way, way too far out in front of ourselves, nothing is officially official with this yet. I think that we just went through this with Jim Harbaugh. I know Vikings fans want to know who their next head coach is. Nothing can be made official until after the Super Bowl, like you said earlier. And let's get to that point to kind of actually raise our glasses and say, hey, the Vikings had their next head coach, because there were some weird rumors coming out of Jacksonville saying that they wanted to get their hands on him with an interview after the Super Bowl. Now, if there's a guy that wants to go to Jacksonville instead of what the Vikings have on their roster, be my guest. I think that's kind of a dumpster fire situation down there in Jacksonville. But I do agree with that. I certainly think with Kevin O'Connell coming in, there is a better chance that there's a different quarterback starting for the Vikings in 2022.
Yeah, I mean, you have these opportunities. We remember the whole situation with Josh McDaniels accepting a head coaching job. I don't remember what team it was for. Do you remember what team it was?
Was it the Colts?
I honestly don't remember, but he rescinded that offer or the acceptance in this period of time between signing an actual contract and it kind of leaking to the press. There could be other players too, Jack, that have situations. I think we talk about Kirk Cousins and how it makes it more likely that he would be maybe moved. You have to have a partner to dance with. Okay, you can't just do that because you want to. You have to have the right deal, and you have to have somebody else coming in interested in Kirk Cousins. I think there will be interest. If it's the right deal or not, that's what's going to make the determining factor. But you have fresh blood, you have fresh mind, fresh opinions on the entire roster. You have a fresh scheme coming in. We talked about this defense and some of those aging defenders were Mike Zimmer handpicked players for his system. That may not be the case going forward. We mentioned names like Anthony Barr, like Daniil Hunter, trying to figure out his contract. The guys in the middle, Dalvin Tomlinson, Harrison Smith, even on the back end. This is going to be a new defense. It's going to be a new offense. I think that the only players that are safe on this roster, I said players, I think Justin Jefferson is safe. I think I think Eric Kendricks is safe. Are you confident about anybody else? Any other names like that you're 100% confident about? I think Dalvin Cook is pretty safe because he doesn't have a giant cap hit this year. But anybody else that you're completely confident is going to be safe? That's not a special teamer or something like that.
Yeah, I think you can safely assume that there's a few guys along that offensive line. I kind of look at Ezra Cleveland,
Right.
Christian Darrisaw, obviously rookie left tackle, and Brian O'Neill. You can't really lose that because that's one area of this team that certainly cannot take a step backwards, regardless of who the quarterback is going to be next year. But I wanted to say this too, because PA mentioned something on his show today about how there was some preliminary conversations last year about Kirk Cousins with the Jared Goff trade to the Rams, which I thought was interesting because you also look at the draft from last year. There was this census that there was some pressure from the top down from the Wilfs to move up and get Fields. And if it wasn't Fields, it was pretty clear that they wanted a quarterback drafted. So I think there's certainly this belief that the Wilfs might not have 100% confidence in Kirk Cousins. And if there's a new GM and a new 36-year-old head coach, I think that can be persuaded from ownership down a little bit easier. I don't think the Wilfs really want to get their hands on this roster because that's why you hire a smart guy like Kwesi Adofo-Mensah to come in and do that himself. But there might certainly still be some pressure from the ownership group down towards the GM and head coach and say, you know what? We don't know how we feel about Kirk Cousins. And there's certainly going to be conversations within that building between the owners, the new GM and the new head coach about what is going to be the process moving forward at the quarterback position.
With Kevin O'Connell, again, believing these reports and believing that it goes through to fruition, Kevin O'Connell becomes the next Minnesota Vikings head coach. What are your expectations for the 2022 season, and how do they change based on what we thought we were going to have maybe with Jim Harbaugh?
I think the expectation is always going to be you don't go into the season with the hopes of having a losing record and missing out on the playoffs. And I think he's going to come in here. He's a younger guy. He has a good offensive scheme. He comes from a great coaching tree, and he's getting handed the keys to a pretty darn good offense. I don't know, like we said, we don't know if Kirk Cousins is the guy manning that offense necessarily in 2022, but regardless, there's playmakers all over the field. They get Irv Smith Jr. back, who was the rave of training camp this summer. I'm excited. I think he's going to come in here. I saw someone tweet it out, and I'm forgetting who it was, but the Rams in 2021 ran the most out of 11 personnel in the league. A ton of motion, just a lot of excitement, which I think this Vikings fan base has been kind of craving now for the last couple seasons. I think he's going to come in here and he's going to bring that. I would expect the offense to produce fireworks, but at the end of the day, this offense hasn't really been the problem per se either. It's been that defense. So I don't have super high expectations that the defense is going to get figured out in year one. I still think the offense, hopefully you see the offense fire on all cylinders because that's why you bring them in here. You want to see the explosiveness, but that defense might take a year or two to catch up, and you're going to have to do that through the draft and hit it on free agents, something that hasn't been the strong suit of this team for the last couple seasons.
It hasn't been the strong suit of Rick Spielman, and he's not in the mix anymore. Jack, I do think that this season you're going to have to temper your expectations with 2022. They're going to be entertaining. They're going to be in some games, but it will be a bit of a rebuild. But I think it's a really quick rebuild. I think that you have an opportunity to clear some cap space potentially this year by trading Kirk Cousins, get some assets back, whether they're draft picks or young players. You have that opportunity to move that big contract and start that rebuild right away with some cornerstones already in place, with Dalvin Cook, with Justin Jefferson, with some of those defenders, with an offensive line that isn't great, but they have some pieces there, and you feel like maybe you're one or two pieces away from being solidified. That puts you in a position then where if you are able to get a quarterback, whether that is a bridge quarterback that turns into something longer than a bridge, or you get the right young quarterback, right? You get an extra first-round pick. You find a way, Malik Willis, is that his name? Malik Willis, right? Everyone's all over this guy right now, okay? There's no guarantee. There's no guarantee that a quarterback will come to the league, whether you're picked number 1 overall or in the 6th round like Tom Brady. No guarantee that you're going to turn into what they think you are in the NFL. That being said, if they can hit on a quarterback I'm not even saying a generational quarterback. I'm not saying the Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes kind of thing. But if they can hit on a quarterback that can be a franchise quarterback for this team, they could be back in the running 1, maybe 2 seasons from now with a lot of cap space, with Justin Jefferson still on a rookie contract, with Dalvin Cook still in the mix, and still have some pieces to be a dynamic team with a new GM, a new head coach, and a quick rebuild. Am I crazy for thinking that this is a quick rebuild as opposed to something like the New York Jets and Jacksonville Jaguars with that long-term picture?
I don't think so. And it's really funny that you bring up the name Malik Willis. I have that written down here. I was going to talk about that tonight before you brought that up, because out of the quarterbacks that are down at the Senior Bowl, he has been the strongest through the first 2 days. Someone that's certainly worth monitoring. The Senior Bowl is on this weekend, or I think it's this weekend. I don't know the exact date and time, but make sure to tune into that, because there's pretty much every single draft-worthy quarterback that as a Vikings follower you should keep your eyes on are going to be participating in the Senior Bowl outside of Matt Corral. He is the only one that isn't down there. So, yeah, I agree with you. I think if you can kind of reduce that cap hit, it's going to be kind of nerve-wracking per se right at the beginning of this, because there is going to be a lot of change, and I don't necessarily know if Vikings fans are going to handle that well, because some of their favorite players that have been their favorite players throughout the Mike Zimmer era, I don't necessarily think they're safe anymore. And you kind of were alluding to that a little bit earlier, but I don't think it's wrong to say this could be a quick rebuild, kind of retooling rather than rebuilding. I think you can get, I don't necessarily like saying that, because I do think there are some contracts that have to be worked out. And like I said, some bigger names might have to go, but I don't think it will take that long because of the pieces they already have in place on that offensive side of the ball. It's going to be really interesting to see who O'Connell brings in as his defensive coordinator, because that's going to have to be a good relationship, and they're going to have to get off to a quick start on how to figure out how to retool that defense.
We might have a guest joining us in a minute here, so we're going to stick on for a couple more minutes. I'm just kind of keeping an eye on the chat too. I put a poll out right after all this happened, Jack, to see what people were thinking, what their reactions were. Harbaugh out, Kevin O'Connell set to become the next Minnesota Vikings head coach. How do you feel? Are you excited, disappointed, relieved, or frustrated? This is still up on my Twitter at AJKFAN if you want to get in on that. But most people, 50%, almost 50% of them were excited. Then you get the disappointed at 22.5. You have some that are relieved and some that are frustrated. But the excitement surrounding Kevin O'Connell. Tell me what's exciting, Jack, about O'Connell, what he brings to the fold, and what he might add for this Minnesota Vikings team just starting next year.
Well, he's everything that Vikings fans were kind of calling for prior to finding out that a coach like Jim Harbaugh was available. He's young. He's 36 years old. Comes from a good coaching tree. Sean McVay, he's kind of been taken under Sean McVay's wing the last couple years. And he has that connection with Kirk Cousins as well. I think that's huge, because at the end of the day, whether or not you are a Kirk Cousins believer, having someone come in that has the relationship there, knows exactly what he brings to the table, I think that's huge. And I think those conversations were already had with Kwesi Adofo-Mensah throughout the interview process. So I think there's a lot to like there. He's very good schematically. He's very smart, and he's going to bring analytics and what Kwesi brings to the table. Excuse me. He's going to bring that on board too. So I think Vikings fans are right to be excited.
Jack, if they do trade Kirk Cousins, what's the plan for next year? Is it Kellen Mond? Is it finding a guy like, I know this sounds like a joke, but like Teddy Bridgewater? Is there a bridge quarterback that we should maybe be thinking of to keep this thing interesting?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few out there, certainly. I think if you decide to move on from Kirk Cousins, I think at the end of the day, you have to draft a quarterback at some point. I think there's a lot of belief that there's not a lot of quarterbacks that should be first round picks. So maybe the Vikings get lucky and one falls into the second round. I don't know. I still like the idea of drafting a rookie quarterback, bringing in a bridge type quarterback, and having Kellen Mond, and kind of letting all three of them just go at it throughout training camp, and let the new coaching staff kind of develop all three of them and see where they can get them to. A couple names that I like. I like Marcus Mariota. I don't think Marcus Mariota is going to come into Minnesota and win a Super Bowl. I also didn't think Case Keenum was going to come to Minnesota and get the Vikings to an NFC Championship game and have one of the most electric seasons of my lifetime. So I think Marcus Mariota, Gardner Minshew, I don't know if you saw the video of him pulling the samurai sword out. He is electric, super entertaining. A guy like that has a history, Marcus Mariota, a former Heisman Trophy winning quarterback, someone that's exciting, maybe a backup that like a Drew Lock type that's behind Teddy Bridgewater as well. But I wouldn't be opposed to doing something like that. But again, at the end of the day, if Kevin O'Connell comes in and says, you know what, Kirk Cousins is my guy, I think Vikings fans have to be ready for something like that too, because although I think you and I are both on the same page, that is certainly very realistic that Kirk Cousins is the quarterback this year as well.
All right, we do have a special guest joining us now, and I think we're going to go to a very special location as we bring in the voice of the Minnesota Vikings, Paul Allen, live from the hot tub, it looks like. How you doing, PA?
Yeah, this must be a big occasion for me to actually turn the jets off so I could hear you. I mean, I was thinking for a second maybe Jack needs to get closer to his mic, or maybe it's this noise right here that I need to eliminate. What's going on, boys?
Not a whole lot. Got the 120-degree temperature water going. That looks mighty fine right there, PA. Hey,
it's good, man. Oh, it's good. You know what water's all about, AJ?
Yeah, no doubt, my brother. We've been talking, obviously, about the news tonight. Jim Harbaugh going back to the University of Michigan, and the reports are that Kevin O'Connell, after the Super Bowl, will be named the next head coach of the Minnesota Vikings. Just tell us your initial thoughts as this came out. Were you thinking Harbaugh was a done deal? Did you get a sense that it wasn't working out as the interview went long into the day? How do you feel about Kevin O'Connell?
Well, I mean, it's unless I've missed something, is the Kevin O'Connell news official?
Nothing official. Can't be official.
So you got big timers saying, I mean, you're going to get. I saw Chad Graff's tweet before I jumped in here. So I mean, you're going to get respected locals like Graff, Krasinski, and so on. Courtney, Gessling, all the names. Okay, nobody's to be offended. Everybody's a respected local. But then you're going to get Pelissero, Schefter, guys like that. They're going to be checking in and offering up, what they know from what happened today and what's going to be next. So if Kevin O'Connell, the Rams offensive coordinator, were to become the next Vikings head coach, I wouldn't be surprised at all. And really, for those who listen to 9 to Noon, and I'm going to go through this whole thing tomorrow again, but really the only way for me to address it or handle it is just to pretty much regurgitate or share what we've talked about this week, where I just found it very, very interesting and kind of crazy that the NFC title game was Sunday. And in that game between the Niners and the Rams, you have at least 3 coaches who either want the Vikings job or the Vikings want them. So everybody agrees with that, right?
Yep.
All right. So now all of a sudden, Saturday night, a Zoom with Jim Harbaugh pops up on a Saturday night, the night before the game. And, of course, it leaks because that's just how it works. And everybody goes to Twitter. But maybe, with the timing of when that came out, by that time, O'Connell, Morris, Ryans, McDaniel, whomever, well, they all were done with their meetings and everything. And they're settled in for the game the next day. So, that's the timing of that is a little too perfect for me. Who knows how Saturday schedules work before games? Fellowship, Catholic Mass, 7:30, chill out for a little bit. Then the meeting's at 8, team meeting with the coach talking around 9. Everybody does it that way. And that's about when the whole thing broke. It was early evening or whatever. So I found that to be curious, the timing of it. And then, our leadership team or the hiring team flies to Southern California. Now, they're not going there unless they want somebody. So they go there, and that's interview number 2 with O'Connell. Raheem Morris, too, maybe. I'm not sure. But then, conspicuously, D'Amico Ryan says, no, I'm good. I want to be a head coach, and I think I can be a head coach. And you interviewed me once. I'm going to go ahead and turn down the second interview. All right. So he knew where some bones were buried. And he's like, yeah, I know it's probably going to be one or one of 2 guys. So I'm out. And again, I'm speculating and just riding my heart right now. So that happens. Then they come back here. And I have no idea what transpired with the offensive or defensive coordinators with the Rams. But whatever it was, it did not turn the local team away from having the big meeting today with Jim. Because when you do that Saturday night bit, whether it was super previously planned or not, that gives Jim an opportunity to win the job, and I fully, firmly, wholeheartedly would wager every dollar I have. Jim Harbaugh wanted this job, and Jim Harbaugh left the facility, or at least an hour before he left the facility, and he didn't know that this was not going to be his job. Okay, and then now he's going to go back to Michigan. How that worked out, I don't know, so I'm not going to guess. But now, so to move on to Kevin O'Connell, I felt with the conspicuous timing of the Saturday night chat with Harbaugh that leverage was potentially being laid down one way or the other. Jim either wants to bump that 4 at Michigan. Now, at Michigan is precarious because they fired their university president 2.5 weeks ago for insubordination with a coworker, hand in the cookie jar terrorism. He's out. So now you got Mary Sue Coleman, maybe. So she's the interim. She's not Tennessee. She's the interim president at the University of Michigan. So now I start reading into that a little bit, thinking, maybe Jim, off that season he beat Ohio State and got things going good there, maybe he wants to bump that 4, and he just is not sure where the leadership of the university is right now in transition. So I put that into the equation. But at the end of the entire thing, if the Minnesota Vikings either wanted Kevin O'Connell to know that if you want to wait or waffle or be like, I love living in California, Sean's great to work for, and we're good, and we might win the Super Bowl, and we're going to be good next year. And he was like, all right, I'll do it. 5 years, $40 million, and just some absurd just number and years. Then maybe next level Kwesi, maybe he's like, cool. I got 2 years in with Jim. Everybody knows it. And it was 2 years at San Francisco where it might not have been great for Jim. Everybody knows that. So we're going to do it again. And we want somebody to know that we are very serious about making a good hire. We will pay what it takes to get this team to the Super Bowl. So are you in or out? And I would bet Kevin O'Connell will be the next head coach here, off the way just everything has laid itself out. So from the serenity of my hot tub, I didn't come in here to hijack the State of the Purple podcast, but you asked, and honestly, boys, and I'll talk to you as long as you want. That's the only way for me to answer your question, is to go back to D'Amico Ryan saying no, Saturday Night Weird, YouTube, Zoom all of a sudden,
right?
And just where we are now, man. So, man, this is just crazy,
Yeah, it's nuts, man. You got coaches on the way out causing drama, coaches on the way in causing drama. One more quick question for you, P, and then we'll let you go.
We can do more than one, man, because now I'm settled in.
Well, hey, whatever you got, we do appreciate it. Assuming that Kevin O'Connell is the next head coach of the Minnesota Vikings, it does mark a little bit of a change with the vibe around. Kwesi obviously brought some change already from Rick Spielman. It brings in a different mindset, an offensive coach. It brings in a younger coach. It brings in a younger leadership group. Quick twitch, is there anything that you see? Like, is there giant changes coming right away for the 2022 season that would come with that sort of a shift?
Define changes. You mean like completely new staff?
You could talk. Well, the staff will be relatively new to some extent. Do you see giant personnel changes? Do you think that the schemes are going to be night and day
first
different?
And foremost, with the new GM, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, and this is my opinion. I mean, it's not like, hey, you better do this. I gotta, I know I'm trying to hire a coach, but I got to figure out first and foremost what I got in Kellen Mond. Okay, and I know I got Kirk under contract, and I know Kirk is good. And I know Kirk has his limitations, but I know he's very, very, very good. And in the rare opportunities he's been given to beat somebody in the last second of a big game, New Orleans, the anti-Vike, Sean Payton, he did. Now, that next game against San Francisco, Patrick Mahomes, Tom Brady, they weren't beating the Niners that day the way they were running the ball. Well, then Mahomes beat them in the Super Bowl, but you get my point there. The Chiefs were better than the Vikings that year for sure. So with Kwesi, I mean, I got to, there were a lot of negative opinions, as you could tell, with Zimmer after the Packers game and how he handled that whole Kellen Mond related press conference. So, there are a fair amount of times that I heard during the course of the year, Kellen can't play. And my heartfelt, honest, black and white response was, well, okay. If we can really draw that conclusion off watching somebody on the scout team, 1,000 times more about it than me. So whatever, by faith, I believe you, but that doesn't mean it has to be completely right. So while he's doing that, and the new head coach obviously is going to want to say in that to figure out what he has there. You start there, and from there, I just wonder who's going to be around the new GM, because this is not, and by admission, an all 22 stand on the field during practice and take notes and break it down. That's I don't think that's him, but that is needed. And whether it's people he has around him now, and there are a lot of spectacular people, Ryan Munnins, Burkhart, along with Jamal Stevenson and Rob Brzezinski, and so on and so on and so on. So that where you go from there answers your question about personnel, because the head, I want, if Kevin O'Connell is going to be the next head coach of the Minnesota Vikings, bravo, because I want the McVay tree. And I'm old school, man. So when somebody says, hey, the 2020 wide receiver draft is the best in the history of the NFL. Okay, cool. I don't watch college football, so I got to see it. Well, I've seen it, and they were right. This McVay and the way he does it, and he sits on the cooler and doesn't even watch Wade Phillips and the whole thing. Great, cool. Went to the Super Bowl, cool. But you just need to see it over time. And I've seen it with Matt LaFleur and the way he operates things for the most part. Staley, I think did a fine job with the LA Chargers his very first year. And lo and behold, Zach Taylor was an offensive coordinator for the Cincinnati Bearcats 5 years ago. He has 19 wins and 32 losses, and he's in the Super Bowl. And he's from I want that McVay tree. My intel on O'Connell from somebody who knows him very well and has worked with him somewhere in the past. Absolute born leader from a communication standpoint, and also very into collaborative efforts where it doesn't have to be his way or the highway. Now, for the 2022 Vikings, from a personnel standpoint, I'm not going to guess that, honestly, because I don't know how the money magician Rob Brzezinski can work that whole thing out. Who wants to lose Daniil if he's healthy? Who wants to lose Barr if he's healthy? Who wants to lose Peterson? Patrick. I don't want to lose those guys. And Irv's coming back, but I don't want to lose Tyler Conklin, but you can't keep them all. Right. So it's too hard for me to answer that. But what is certain is the Minnesota Vikings offense and defense will be different than what we've seen ever since Gary Kubiak was amplifier coordinator with Stefanski by his side. And then it's Stefanski, and then he's a coach, and then it's Gary, and then it's Clint. It's going to be different. And that is going to require a new level of memorization and a new level of commitment and repetitions. And, you may have to wait a little bit for it to be good. But I've heard nothing but great things about Kevin O'Connell. He was my favorite person to be the next coach every step of the way. The Harbaugh stuff jumped up, threw me off like it did a lot of other people. But if the Vikings hire Kevin O'Connell, bravo.
PA, I have a question for you. You don't have to necessarily speculate on this.
Let me wipe my phone.
But AJ and I were talking a little bit about this, about the state of the quarterback position moving forward. And you mentioned something that just kind of clicked in my head. Again, we already talked about this earlier, but you mentioned this on 9 to Noon today, talking about how there were trade conversations with the LA Rams and Jared Goff for Kirk Cousins. Kind of interested to get your thought on that now that – I'll put air quotes around it, that now that there's a chance Kevin O'Connell is coming to Minnesota, do you think that means Kirk Cousins is likely the guy for Kevin O'Connell? What have you – I kind of want to get your thought on Kellen Mond a little bit too. But.
It's an excellent question. You're very observant with the way you've listened to 9 to Noon, because I'm, as AJ knows, inside and out. But as most people know, I'm not going to be the guy to jump on Twitter and say breaking. I just caught this nugget. The Vikings might have done this with the Rams. But, I felt it was time to slide it in a little bit in the context of the conversation, simply because it involves somebody with the Rams. Cousins is on this team, and Stafford is in the Super Bowl. So what I shared was, I've known for a little while, and I would bet that it's accurate, even though I've never asked Kirk or Matthew Stafford, or McVay or O'Connell or anything. But last offseason, when the Rams were looking to move Jared Goff, they ended up obviously with Matthew Stafford, but they may have inquired about Cousins, and they may have made a decision of the two, or maybe whomever else is involved, they wanted Matthew. Now, Kevin O'Connell, the offensive coordinator, if that indeed is happening, he knows every single thing that's happening. And, Kevin was with Kirk in 2017 in Washington. As I've shared 9 to Noon, just because he was with him there doesn't mean he's infatuated with the whole situation. So, Kirk's good, okay? And I'm not one that really is going to sit here in the details, man, and just, it comes down to big moments and how you handle them. And Kirk has not had many in the postseason, but in that Saints game, he came through when the anti-Vike put Patrick Robinson on Adam Thielen, and the anti-Vike had to pay. But if you think about the games this year, and I quote tweeted somebody earlier in the day who tweeted like, Kirk Cousins either outplayed or played with these 6 quarterbacks during the year. And 3 of them were losses. And then I quote tweeted from my Twitter that it just triggered my memory to how good Kirk was at the end of the Carolina game, the Arizona game with KJ, the second half of the Cincinnati game. He beat Rodgers and he beat Green Bay and Pittsburgh. Just how good he was for the most part. Seattle got snoozy and there were some other problems. The Browns game too. But Kirk was cold-blooded as bleep in most of those games when the pressure was at its highest. So that's there too, and Kevin knows that. Kirk will be the quarterback for the team next year. I can't see how they trade him, honestly. So he'll be the quarterback. The rest of the personnel, that's up for debate.
All right, PA, we'll let you turn the bubbles back on and enjoy the hot tub.
Why, man? I'm having a good time. Hopefully I didn't wreck your
no, are you kidding me?
No, we appreciate it, PA.
No, you added a lot to it, some different opinions and a different style too. We're both wearing shirts, so we were just missing.
Yeah, hopefully this was copacetic.
Yeah,
getting in here with the relaxation, but all this Harbaugh stuff, it worked on my last nerve in my right rhomboid, and I'm gonna come into 9 to Noon tomorrow, super fresh and ready to fire.
There you go. Thank you, PA. We appreciate it. We'll talk to you later. That was pretty cool. Always love that guy and love his opinions. Obviously, he knows a heck of a lot more about all this stuff than we do. Some of it is, stuff he's hearing around the facility and with text messages, and some of it is just intelligence and knowledge that he brings to the table. So very much appreciate PA joining the fold. You can hear more from him. He's going to think about it all night. That's him. He doesn't go to sleep. He'll think about this situation all night and come 9 to Noon tomorrow with some really good heat and some probably some more intel and a bunch of interviews too. That Rolodex that he has and the conversation ability he has is great. Jack, we've gone almost 45 minutes. We were going to go 20 and talk about this, and then PA joined, and we couldn't stop him from sharing his little tidbits there. So we'll wrap it up here for the night. Again, Jim Harbaugh back to the University of Michigan. Kevin O'Connell, soon to be the next head coach of the Minnesota Vikings, according to reports. Can't happen until after the Super Bowl, but once we get to that point, it'll be all said and done, unless something crazy happens, and we can't rule that out based off of the way that this coaching hunt and the postseason or offseason, has gone for the Minnesota Vikings so far. If you're new to the State of Purple podcast, this is the KFAN weekly Minnesota Vikings podcast. This week it's been daily. We've had an episode every single day. You can find it on iHeartRadio, iTunes, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. We'd love for you to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Jack Day joins in. He writes for KFAN.com. He also joins in on the State of Purple podcast and shares his insight. We're going to get into college scouting. That's Jack's forte, something he's really interested in. He's paying attention to the Senior Bowl right now. He's paying attention to the draft class and stocks for all those players. So if you want to follow him on Twitter, it's Jack_H_Day, and you can get all his insight there. You can hit me on Twitter at AJKFAN and join in on these interactive chats every week at the minimum, sometimes more than once a week for the State of Purple. So it's late. I am hungry. I need to gather myself and get ready for another day because, Jack, as a Minnesota Vikings fan and somebody who covers this team, who the heck knows what's going to happen tomorrow, because it could just continue to get more and more weird. So, Jack, I appreciate the time tonight. Appreciate PA joining. Catch him 9 to noon on KFAN tomorrow. And check out KFAN.com as we continue to have everything covered with this crazy coaching search for the Minnesota Vikings. For Jack Day, I'm AJ Mansour. This has been the State of Purple podcast. See you later.
10 seconds to go. We need a Minneapolis miracle. Case on a deep drop. Steps up in the pocket. He'll fire to the right side.